So welcome to the Tuesday Feldenkrais Awareness Through Movement lesson, streaming live from Jefferson Farm Kitchen in Jacksonville, Oregon. And it's Tuesday, the 5th of May, 2020. It's also Cinco de Mayo, I think, huh?
My sister's birthday.
So our topic today is, are you exhausted? We're about to encounter the third supermoon in 2020. And so this is meant to be a movement lesson for people who are just really tired. And that's something that, you might not go to an exercise class when you're really tired, but I think there's definitely a place for doing an awareness through movement class when you're really tired, because the question is, why are we perhaps experiencing more fatigue? And I would say that we're processing on a very deep level. And so all I know is, when I worked in food, I worked a lot in kitchens as a prep cook and a chef kind of a thing, and a health food place in Princeton, New Jersey. It was like a health food diner. It was one of the first ones. It was kind of fun. Tiny little kitchen. But all I know is it just got really crazy during a full moon. And then later on, as I was working as a body worker with nurses who were dealing with the emergency room, they swore up and down, yes, life gets really hectic in the emergency room when there's a full moon. And then in obstetrics too, they would say there were more babies born when there's a full moon. So there's probably something going on there. People who work in bars also say that it gets really crazy during the full moon. So I believe there's no smoke without fire. So let's just dive right in. And I'll talk a little more about that while we're doing breaks and while you're resting. But if you're new to the Feldenkrais method of awareness through movement, we don't demonstrate the movement. It's like a puzzle or a treasure hunt, which is why I prefer to do movement lessons live, because then I really have no idea where it's going. And it becomes this adventure where you move very slowly. You're given a direction that provides constraints, much like when you're cooking and you can't go to the store. Sound familiar? And you have to cook something out of what you have. That often it increases people's creativity. And so by the same token, when you have a movement lesson that is intentionally designed to make you notice your unconscious habits by creating a framework where you're asked to move in non-habitual ways, it puts you in beginner's minds. You see things that you wouldn't normally see, and you feel things that you wouldn't normally feel. And this is all about refining your ability to sense yourself, because clearly when we ignore how we feel, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. and the same thing happens with pain. So the nervous system is a biofeedback mechanism. An example of that would be, you put your hand on a stove, you feel it's hot, you pull it away immediately. So in that sense, we all trust our nervous system to tell us when we're about to burn ourselves. But we're not always quite so intelligent about emotions. And Feldenkrais offers a way to process emotions sometimes on an unconscious level without having to talk about it. So that said, I would just give you the guidelines of move slowly, pay attention to what you're doing, because if you do that, you can't hurt yourself. And only go as far as you can go easily. Don't go beyond your, don't overextend yourself. In other words, go to the extent of your limitation and back off from there. All right, so let's start with the body scan. If you would, lie on the floor, and hopefully you have a mat or quilt or something you can lie comfortably on the floor that's flat, so that you can use the floor as a feedback mechanism. And notice where you're breathing, what parts of your ribs move as you inhale and as you exhale. And today we're going to do a lesson that's designed to be one that's very gentle and small and sort of a lazy lesson. But there's something going on with this lesson regarding the right side of the body and the left side of the body. So if you would compare the entire right side to the entire left side. And if you were to compare them in terms of length, is there any aspect of yourself that's longer on one side than the other? Well, how could you tell? You could imagine a point on the front of your shoulder and the front of your pelvis and draw a line there and imagine in your imagination, and draw a line on the other side from the same 2 points. Just notice if the line is the same length or if they're parallel. Maybe one is at an angle. So you're sort of taking an inventory of what you're taking an inventory here of is the pattern of that marks the range of what you do in a day. So in other words, if you sit on your right hip all day long when you're working, you might find that your right side is shorter than the other, more collapsed somehow. And that what you do most of the day without paying attention, you can begin to notice in very short order and change very quickly if you bring awareness to the table, if you bring mindfulness to the table, you can make changes much more quickly. So notice if your head seems to be turned facing one side more than the other, or if it seems to be tipped a little bit one side more than the other, towards your left side or your right side more. And you could roll your head a little bit slowly, just to take it for a test drive, just to notice what's the trajectory of your chin. Does it get closer to one shoulder than the other? So you're beginning to imagine lines in space that represent the movement of your chin in space. And you're expanding your self-image when you do awareness through movement, because you could also notice the trajectory of the contact of the back of your head on the floor as you roll, and notice, is it kind of curved on one side and it sort of flattens out and gets level on the other? It's not uncommon. And then bring it to a halt in the middle, slowly. And notice that, that's another job that your nervous system has. It's to figure out where is center. It's to keep your head safe in space. It's to keep your head upright when you're looking at something, so that the contents of your mainframe, your brain, are kept safe at all times. So what else could the floor reflect back to us? It could reflect how much tension you may have in your lumbar spine. So notice if there's more space under your back on one side than the other as well. And then for this lesson, I meant to say this first, but you might need a towel, or preferably a harder cushion. We like to use a blanket because you can fold it, or a towel because it can be a little bit harder, or those pads that they use for gardening. And if you would roll onto your, whichever side you prefer. Which side would you prefer to lie on today? And I'm going to get a blanket for you to rest your head on. What do you think? What's your preferred side? Okay. Yeah. So now put your legs one on top of the other and just notice that, notice how easy it is to roll a little bit forward and backward on your side. And what do you have to do to make yourself more stable when you're lying on your side? So you might notice that if you have one knee on top of the other and you bend both knees a bit, it actually holds you pretty stable. So that, I mean, most people don't think about this. Am I truly on my side, or am I actually, do I have a tendency to lean a little bit forward or to lean a little bit backward because that's just more comfortable and something I do without noticing it. So for this lesson, see if you can be really truly on your side. And I mention that just so you notice that you may have patterns that you're not aware of, and to begin to start to integrate that as a part of your process, that you notice the patterns that you normally wouldn't notice. And if you would, bring your attention to your breath and start to notice that when you inhale, you can't really just inhale into one lung, but you can intend to breathe more into your, let's say you're lying on your right side, so breathe more into your left lung. And if you're truly on your side, it might be good to have your left hand on your hip. And could you really make yourself comfortable on your side in this way, so that you're breathing deeply into and expanding your left lung more than the other. And notice if you feel an increase in pressure underneath you as you breathe into your left lung. And could you visualize how, as you breathe into that left lung, you can breathe and it goes up towards the ceiling, but it can't just go up, right? So it also goes out. It goes, as you breathe into that left lung, it expands upwards and forwards and backwards simultaneously. Can you visualize how the ribs might be moving a little bit further apart and coming back together as you exhale? So you're really beginning to clarify more and more of your self-image by visualizing what you're feeling and really connecting more to your skeleton, which no other movement kind of does. It doesn't really connect us to our skeleton, but that's what provides us with stability and space. And notice that there is a sensation underneath the ribs on the right side as you take these deeper breaths, so that you really can't just use one side of yourself. The other side is always stabilizing you in some way. And becoming aware of that can make you more stable as well. And let that go. And could you just lift your left leg, your top leg, the entire leg, just maybe 2 or 3 inches off the other leg, and set it down 3 or 4 times. And notice that you may have to inhibit the temptation to really make a big movement, right? Who lifts their leg just an inch or 2? But it's for the purpose of noticing how heavy your leg feels. And it's for the purpose of intentionally creating a non-habitual way of lifting, so that maybe you can sense where you feel something change underneath you as you lift. And yeah, 3 or 4 times is plenty, so let that rest. And just sit there and breathe, relax for a moment. So at the risk of being intentionally sarcastic, I have to ask, why wouldn't we be exhausted, when our entire world has changed so dramatically? Because below the surface, we still haven't quite processed it all. And then if you would, go back to the movement where you lift the leg, set it down, so you rest it on the other leg, and then you alternate by taking a deep breath into your left lung. And just do this slowly at your own pace. You lift the leg, set it down, breathe into the lung, relax the lung, and really pause. So you're very systematic. You pause in between, and then lift the leg, and alternate that way a few times. And can you almost sense like a rhythm? You could get into a rhythm between the upper body and the lower body, where it almost helps you to lift the leg when you get done with the inhale, or vice versa. And then let that go and rest on your side for a moment. And just notice how sometimes sometimes in the course of a movement lesson, you'll be reminded of something. And sometimes the memories are hard to place. They're just not even visual, they're felt. And just notice what you're thinking about, where your mind goes, if you're aware of having emotions, or if you're not. Just sort of take what comes without judgment. And then this time, could you keep your leg resting on your knee and just lift your lower leg and foot towards the ceiling and set it down on the other leg? And so this could be a larger movement. So lift your leg as far as you can go easily without any strain in your knee or your hip, and then set it down. And bring your attention to your top hip and notice, what do you sense in your hip? So in this case, your left hip. As you lift your foot, your knee resting on the other one, just the lower leg and foot towards the ceiling, can you allow yourself to feel anything moving in the front of your left hip as you lift your foot? What do you sense on the floor underneath you? And if you have your hand resting on your hip, you may even get feedback from that. And so in Feldenkrais, we're always interested in not in isolating muscular movement or effort, but in how can you do this more easily, make it smoother? How can you use more of yourself? So could you roll a little bit in the pelvis forward and have that be a little bit of an aid to lifting the foot? Because the truth is, your nervous system is a system that runs throughout your entire self. So you can't ever use just part of it. And we're really working with the nervous system, not with isolated muscles. Because the goal isn't strength training, it's effortless lightness and ease. And then put your foot down and rest for just a moment. And notice if you feel any telltale complaining. Your body has a mind, and it speaks its mind, but most of the time we don't listen. So complaining would be little niggling sensations in your knee that says, wow, that's a little bit too much. Don't go quite as far, for example. And I mean, you really do have to spend time getting to know yourself if you want to have more freedom and more choice. So it's another big piece of what awareness through movement lessons are in general is learning how to do the same thing in a couple of different ways, for example. So you have choices about how you do something. Because when we only have one option, that's often when we feel trapped, and that is a huge source of anxiety. So go back to lifting just the foot, but could you think in terms of lifting with the toe, so that the toe is higher than the heel, so that you're leading with the forefoot or the outside of your toe. That's it. And then when you set your foot down, gently pick it up again and lift with the heel, so that you're changing the foot so that the heel leads instead of the little toe. And notice how that feels different throughout your knee and into your hip. And notice that the longer you do this, the more you play with it and pay attention, you can start to feel it further and further up into your body. And notice that it's hard to be soft and to move evenly so that you move upwards and downwards at the same pace. So that sounds a little bit like a bit of a paradox, right? It's hard to be soft, but it's true. It's like it's hard to move. It's harder to move slowly than it is to move fast. Anyone who's a skilled drummer knows that a drum solo that slows down is a much, much more technically demanding skill than speeding up. Anybody remember Ginger Baker's solo? Very famous. Okay, I'm dating myself. All right, so give it a rest and lie on your back. And here's where you may start to notice that there is a distinctly one-sided difference in how you feel. Notice if you feel more flat on one side than the other. And just revel in the enjoyment of being still, because how often are we really still during the day? And how often do we give ourselves permission to enjoy being still? So things trigger us in the most unexpected ways. And I think part of how I came on this topic was also seeing this article that was in a local paper, actually a week or so ago, but it was about how this sheltering at home had triggered memories in Holocaust survivors because they were reminded of hiding from the Nazis in Germany during World War II. And so sometimes the most unexpected things can trigger us. And so, why would we be exhausted? Well, we have fewer choices about where we can go and what we can do. And every time we think, oh yeah, I'll just go to the store, maybe I'll go out to dinner, or wouldn't it be nice to just do something different for a change? We go, oh yeah, I can't, I gotta go home and shelter in the safety of my own home. And so there's a lot of processing going on, and resting is one of the ways that we process. We process when we sleep. And I noticed this as a kid. I liked dogs, and I got a dog, and I was puppy training, and I noticed sometimes that if I tried to get the puppy to learn something, if I just kept trying to get him to learn it, sometimes it was like, he just had enough. His attention span was too short. But if I just did a little bit, just 15 minutes, and then I let him go to sleep, sometimes I'd find that, and the next morning he learned it better than if I had spent 45 minutes on it, because we learn when we're sleeping and we integrate things when we're sleeping. And that's one of the main things that Feldenkrais method is about. It's about how can we integrate parts of ourselves that we've been too busy to pay any attention to, so that we can have more choice and more freedom of motion and more skill, so that we can live skillfully without exhausting ourselves by exerting more effort than we need to, for example. Like, do you ever remember maybe hearing yourself or someone else, but like a teenager stomping down the hall, or maybe you're living in a house, and can you remember a time when you were living in a house or visiting somebody who had teenagers, and you didn't, you weren't, not used to that. Maybe you lived at home, and you didn't have any kids in the house, and you were struck by, wow, that kid just like stomps down the hallway with incredible amount of effort. But for them, it's not so much of a deal. They have a lot more energy, right? But the thing is, if you do that for a lifetime, that's why you run out of energy. That's why our batteries run out. If we if we use excessive force in our everyday movements. So if you would return to the same side and make yourself comfortable, and just be lazy about rolling over. And can you just touch base with uh, breathing into the left lung? Excuse me. Breathing into the left lung again a few times, so that you're expanding upwards and forwards and backwards. There must be a phrase for that. Expanding in 3 dimensions. Yeah. And then at some point, let that go. And with your leg resting or your foot resting where it is, can you play with that other movement? So what we did before was you lifted the heel and you lifted the toe. Maybe just to clarify the planes of motion, just leaving your leg, your lower leg where it is, just lift the heel up so that the toe stays where it is. That's it. And then leave the heel where it is and lift the forefoot up. So that's, I guess if you thought about it as a way of rotating around your shin bone, you could call that it's almost like a rotation, but it's not. So let that go. And the other plane of motion I wanted to play with was this ability that we have. So you've got 26 bones in the foot, right, that we mostly don't access. But what they call supination and pronation in anatomical terms is when you alternate lifting the arch of your foot, so that it's kind of like your heel and your toes stay relatively in the same place, but you're lifting the inside of your foot and then relax. And the opposite of that would be to lift the outside of your foot. And so if that's not really clear, just imagine you're standing, and this is actually how, when people sprain their ankle, it's because there's a rigidity there, that they're not able or mobile in this way where they can lift the arch to accommodate if their balance requires it, or lift the outside of the foot, the side of the foot where the little toe is. Is this making any sense? No. Well, it's a tiny, tiny little movement. If you were standing and you lifted the arch of your foot, it would throw your knee to the outside. Does that make sense? Yeah, so that's an idea. Put your foot on the floor so that your knee is up towards the ceiling and you're on your back. If you just for a moment. And then, so with the knee bent, the foot that's on the floor, if you lift the instep up towards the ceiling, so your foot, keep your foot flat on the floor and just lift the instep and allow your knee to rock to the outside as you lift the instep and the, yeah. And so the heel and the toe more or less stay on the floor. It's almost like you have this ability to round your foot as you lift your instep. And maybe that's what people do who paint with their feet, right? They put a paintbrush between their toes, and the way that they clench it is possibly by lifting the instep. And if you were to go the other way, the range is even smaller. I mean, you can only lift maybe a half an inch, or maybe 2/3 of an inch. You can lift the outside of the instep off the floor. And the reason that this is useful is to accommodate when you're walking on a surface that is really rocky or jagged or bumpy in some way, and you have to, your foot has to be able to adapt to the floor. And so most of us, when we walk in shoes all the time, we lose that capacity a little bit. And what happens is it strains the ankle, because there are these 27 bones that have the capacity to adapt to peculiar shaped surfaces, but the ankle doesn't have that much flexibility. So the force gets, the strain gets put on the ankle when the foot's not able to adapt. So is that kind of making sense? Okay, so go back onto your side and see if you can do it without the feedback of the floor to clarify what it means to. So actually, hang on a second. So you're gonna leave your knee on the other knee, and you're gonna lift your foot into the air one time with the outside of the foot leading, and that you could call, that's sort of like lifting the outside of the foot, right? And then the next time you lift your foot off your other foot, can you arch the instep more, as if you were, so your knees stay together, you're still lifting your foot, but you're doing that movement where you're taking your foot so that the arch, like in order for you to raise your arch, another way to say it is that you round the top of your foot as if you were squeezing your toes together, as if you were, yeah, there you go. So that's obviously really Greek. It's obviously Greek, right? And that's okay. What's fun is how quickly these things become familiar when you do them with awareness slowly. I mean, it might not happen tonight, but it might happen the next time you play with it, or the third time. So let that go. That's and just relax for a moment and notice if there's any residual clenching in your jaw, because there's this very strange relationship between the feet and the jaw. For some reason, I notice often when I play with some of these lessons, especially when I do something that's unfamiliar like that I might not do all the time, you may feel it as you're resting that you've been doing something funny with your jaw. And this last variation here would be to keep the feet together and just allow the knee to lift. And rather than doing all the work locally in the muscles of your outside of your leg as you lift your knee towards the ceiling, keeping the feet together, make it super, super easy. How could you make it easier? That's it. Perfect. Yes. So maybe not rolling quite so far, but just lifting and rolling a little bit. So by rolling your pelvis backwards, you're being really super intelligent because you're using the weight of your pelvis, which is, you know, it's pretty large, pretty heavy. Largest muscles in the body are in the area of the hip. You're using that weight to help lift your knee towards the ceiling. And I'm noticing myself beginning to rock, just like watching.
If you are connecting up your jaw, what is a good thing to do?
So it's an interesting thing to notice. First of all, it's really important to learn to spread your awareness throughout more of yourself so that you do notice what you're doing that you don't intend to do. But it's a matter of, it's really important to learn how to inhibit things that you don't mean to do. So this is a chance to notice where you have, I mean, this movement in the jaw is a form of tension. So can you do the movement that's requested by the lesson and inhibit any extraneous actions, such as any clenching in the jaw, that aren't really conducive to what you're doing? And if it's hard, if it's really hard, make the movement smaller. So you're making it easier for yourself. So you back off a little bit. And notice if you take your eyes up towards the ceiling when you take your foot up, or your knee up, actually. We were doing knee, weren't we? Your foot stays together, you lift your knee up. And maybe there's less jaw going on with the knee. But notice, where do your eyes go? Do your eyes sort of sync up with your knee? And what if you intentionally tried to scramble a pattern a little bit so that you move quickly for a little bit? In this case, lift the knee and then lift the foot. So lift the knee and lift the foot. Do it a little more quickly and take your eye with the foot and then with the knee. And then now at some point integrate just being still and breathing so that your left lung gets fuller. And notice if you can alternate that with lifting the knee. So breathe into the left lung, lift the left knee, and then lift the foot. So it's almost like a movement that's going all the way down your body. Then you lift the foot, then you lift the knee, and then take the eyes with the knee. And then it's a similar thing. When you breathe into the left lung, you have to somehow inhibit yourself from getting really tense, right? So notice if you can do this the same way that you did before without lifting some part of yourself off the floor that you didn't mean to. And then what if you try to take your eyes in the opposite direction of your knee, say? So you lift the knee and you take your eyes a little bit in the direction of the floor. And you make these changes, taking your eyes in the opposite direction of the foot, and do this in somewhat quick succession to intentionally scramble any unconscious habit patterns you have about how you use your eyes. And then rest for a moment on your side. And then lift the entire leg as you did at the very beginning, just a few inches off the other leg. And notice if you feel like your entire left side is activated when you lift the leg. Or when you set it down and you lift it again, is the side below you on the floor activated equally to stabilize you? Can you feel the activation of your whole side so that there is a sense of the whole side of you being activated? And where do you locate you? The you that is observing and sensing yourself. Is that your body or some other part of you? Like, who's observing this? Who's sensing this? And then go ahead and rest on your back. And so I wanted to talk about this relationship between exhaustion and processing emotions, just to remind people to be a little bit more forgiving with themselves. If they feel tired, go take a nap, because our world is changing, and it's different than it ever was. And I guess most of us are realizing it's never going to be completely the same as it was. As you rest on your back, just notice where your head is facing, if it's facing one side more than the other. And then if you would, roll onto your right side one more time and have your arms at a 90-degree angle in front of you. And can you lift your arm towards the ceiling so that your hand goes towards the ceiling, your elbows relatively straight, and maybe lift it to just behind the vertical. And notice if you can feel the weight of your shoulder blade. And then bring your hands closed again so that you're moving your hand perhaps a little bit more by rolling than you are by, you're not lifting or reaching in any way, shape, or form. So you really, as you lift your hand the next time, your entire arm so that it goes up towards the ceiling, just notice if you're keeping your shoulder close to if you're not reaching as you're lifting, you're just rolling a little bit to raise the arm towards the ceiling so that you can really feel the shoulder blade going around your ribs. That's it. Nice. And how can you make it reversible so that there's really not any lifting or reaching? It's just sort of a rolling that leads towards opening and closing. And notice what you do with your eyes without any instruction. Notice if you were just not aware of them, and notice how many times you may have driven somewhere and gotten there and realized, wow, I don't even remember driving here, but here I am. So some of the things that we do are supposed to be unconscious. So this is not like anti-unconscious movement. It's just checking in to see if the way we move actually serves us. Because it would be like, if you were driving a car and I guess I used this metaphor last time, maybe, if you weren't clear about how to use a clutch, it would be a really bumpy ride. And so you would consciously retrain yourself. And then when you got good at it, it would go into the realm of things that you do without thinking. But most people never check to see if the things that they do without thinking are actually helpful. They just do them, not realizing that some 95% of what we do, we're not even really quite aware of. So the next time your arm comes up towards the ceiling, let your eyes follow your arm. And then stay there with your arm up towards the ceiling and intentionally reach up just another inch with your arm, and notice that you have this range in your shoulder that you could then take it back, and just do that little tiny range of 1 inch of lifting the shoulder blade and moving it back down around the back of yourself. And it feels like a funny sort of mechanistic kind of a piston-like movement, right? And many people are not even aware that they have this range of motion in their scapula. But if you don't, that's called frozen shoulder. And you don't use it, you lose it. So kind of a weird move, but. Okay, and then bring your arm back down, rest your arm, lift your knee, and then roll to lift your arm. And then lift your knee. And if you're curious about that other move, throw that in as well. Here's a funny idea. Let your leg rest for a moment. You're on your side with your arm up towards the ceiling. Could you lift your arm by inhaling into your left lung? And then exhale to let it get a little bit further away. So you're reaching by maybe an inch or two by breathing into your lung. Kind of a strange idea. And then let it go and rest on your back. But it does seem like we're all being called to be a little bit more internal and to go inside ourselves, not just inside our homes, but to think about what really matters to us now. That it certainly looks like travel is not a great idea for quite some time. What else could you do with yourself that would be fun and interesting and fulfilling? Clearly, this is a big deal for me. I like to travel, but I don't see it happening for a little while. So, what do I get out of it? I like seeing how other people live and how they think. And for some reason, it seems often that it's easier to start up conversations with people that you don't know, and people in certain situations are in a different state, right? People who are in vacation resort type places are often, they're in a vacation state of mind. And I noticed this especially when I used to do body work. I do massages at special events, right? And I joke with people after they were done, because maybe 5 people would come up and they'd want like a massage or something. And I do these little 15-minute chair massages. And then I'd say, well, if he owes you money, you should ask him now, because he's in a really good place and he'll probably give you anything you want. So that's a state change. How could we get ourselves into a state change at will? That's kind of a fun idea. Put on some music you like. So go ahead and roll onto your other side. Make yourself comfortable on the other side. Oh, my brother sent me something about some guy in Lausanne, which is the French part of Switzerland. It's a beautiful, very clean, small town on the lake. And apparently You know, in Switzerland, they have very strict rules about noise. You know, like you can't ride a Harley in Switzerland. It's verboten. You can't, it's too loud, right? You can ride one, but they force you to get rid of the muffler. So, but that's why I was impressed by this story where some guy in this apartment complex in the town is doing this like DJ dance tune thing at 7 o'clock in the evening every night. So go ahead and start to breathe into your right lung and just see if you can imagine how the ribs can expand upward towards the ceiling and forward and backward and apart simultaneously. So you're beginning to really train yourself to think geometrically, think geographically, think in 3D. Notice the pressure you feel underneath you. And yeah. So what else could you, when I was in Switzerland growing up, you couldn't vacuum on Sundays because you're not allowed to clean on the Sabbath. And I kind of liked that actually. I liked that all the stores were closed and you weren't allowed to do anything. It gave me complete and full permission to feel like I could just be free and not have any obligation to do anything. That I had, you know, there was no obligation to do something for someone. Uh, so that's why it shocked me to hear this story about this guy who he got permission to do this. They do it for three songs, and he projects music into this apartment complex, and everybody gets out on their patio and they dance for 3 songs, and then they put it away because there are noise restrictions. And one of the most common phrases over there is, you know, it's just not done. I don't think we don't have a phrase like that. We don't have that concept so much in English or in America anyway. The idea that just, you know, propriety is very important. As a matter of fact, we're kind of anti-propriety, I think. So if you would, just try lifting the entire right leg, just an inch or two off the other, and notice the weight of it so that you get into the habit of gauging how much work something is so that you only exert as much work as you need to for whatever it is you're doing. So you're not using excessive force or not having any kind of like parasitic habitual movement going on. And then go to that place where you lifted the leg slightly, then you set the whole leg. We're talking the whole leg still, and then breathe into the lung and see if you can get into some kind of a rhythm with the upper body and the lower body where you're inhaling into the right lung and lifting the leg and alternating. And you may notice that it's actually not quite the same. You may notice that you can't quite breathe into the right lung as much, or maybe you can breathe into it more. Or maybe you don't notice any difference at all. But what I'm alluding to is the fact that there are more lobes on one side than the other. And then just quit whenever you're tired and rest. And always feel free to take a rest at any time, even if there is no instruction to rest. And then when you're ready, could you lift the foot, the lower leg from the knee, and just notice, is there anything you could do to make that easier, to spread the effort throughout more of yourself? And how far can you go without going too far? What do you sense on the floor underneath you? And can you at some point lead with the heel? And notice if your eyes tend to go up towards the ceiling with the heel. And maybe the next time you lift with the heel, well, you could, yeah, that's a bit of a strain, right? To keep doing it that way. So alternate by lifting with the forefoot and then the heel. And notice if your eyes go with the foot. And then could you take your eyes in the opposite direction slightly so that as you lift, your eyes go the other way. And again, can you inhibit the temptation to hold your breath or do anything funny in your jaw? And sometimes when we change what we're doing, you kind of really need to just pause and regroup. And it's almost like clearing the slate. And then rest for a moment. And what are we resting from? You know, like another thing we're resting from is that it takes energy to focus. It takes energy to think. And when you're ready, go back to lifting the foot. And as you lift with the heel and then the forefoot, do you sense anything going on in your spine? And just, be gentle with yourself. So you're really beginning to evolve your ability to sense what you feel rather than always depending on what you see. Because, of course, we're programmed to only think something's real if we can see it, which is kind of ridiculous since there are lots of things that you can't see that are really important, like love and joy. But even the wind is not necessarily visible, it's only visible in its effects. And then maybe rest on your back for a moment and just notice if perhaps the other side of your self feels more flat. You maybe you sense like more openness in the pelvis on one side or on both sides now that you've done a little bit on both sides. So, in a society that has spent a couple hundred years privileging information over intuition, can you learn to trust yourself again at a deeper level, to trust what you feel and to trust your body's impulses? Because sometimes, so I heard this amazing information. I mean, I knew from, studying biology in college that the cells have a polarity. They have an electrical charge, and a positive and a negative charge. Each cell has one. But Bruce Lipton was saying that each cell has the voltage of approximately, it's like 1.4 volts, and um, seven, forget how many cells he said, like 50,000 or something in the body. But whatever the number of cells it was, if you multiply that by 1.4 volts, what I do remember is that there's an electrical charge in the body of 700,000 volts, which he was translating to mean life force, chi, and that's the force, the energy that helps us heal when you cut yourself, which is pretty amazing, right? So there's something going on there. We don't know what it is, but we take all of this for granted. So there's a lot going on underneath the surface. I guess that's all I could say conclusively. But let's go back to that piece where, let's see, maybe bend your right foot and stand your right foot and use the floor as feedback as you try to lift just the instep so that you're sort of, the heel and the forefoot stay on the floor. And yeah, you're just, it's kind of this arching, it's kind of like you're squeezing your toes and that forces your arch to lift. And that's why I was saying it may be how people who paint with their feet hold the brush, right? Because I don't know how else you would, hold it. That's a whole nother lesson. That's called painting the floor. We'll do that one sometime. And then, try the opposite. So one is known as supination, the other is known as pronation in anatomical terms, but that's not really helpful for most people. So really what it involves is lifting the inside of the. So if that's clear, then go back onto your left side and try it on your left side without the floor as feedback. So as you lift your foot towards the ceiling, you go first with the foot arched and then on the inside, and then it's almost like you're arching it on the outside, but it's much, much smaller because the range of motion is smaller there. And see if you can do this strange thing without clenching in your jaw. And just know that this is a valuable place to have mobility, because as we age, if we move with feet that are like blocks, we fall because our feet can't adapt to the differences in the surface that we're standing on. Then pause and just do a few clearing breaths. Maybe even go back to breathing into the right lung and just notice if that feels like a relief, if it feels like an expansion. And now see if you can spread it like a wave up and down the right side of yourself. So you're letting go of the, what you're doing with the actual foot. Just lifting your foot and then your knee, and then breathing into your lung, and then lifting the knee, and then lifting the foot, and then letting your eye go with the foot, And then let your eye go up towards the ceiling with the knee. And then notice what you do with your eyes when you take a deep breath. And then take the eyes in the opposite direction and notice that the eyes don't have as much of a range of motion. So you could make the movements smaller so that you can synchronize them. And then rest on your back just rest on your side for a moment. Just, what was the last piece? Can you remember back? So, yeah, so it's nice to be able to play with this in the morning or the next day. So start taking your right arm up towards the ceiling with the elbow straight but soft, and notice if you can lift your arm by rolling, kind of, so that it's more effortless. And it's like you're more or less keeping your shoulder in one place as the arm goes up. I guess it is going around your ribs, but it's different than the reaching thing. So when you reach, you can actually gain another inch or two. But rather than reaching, could you do it from the shoulder blade by initiating the movement from the shoulder? And then could you initiate the movement from the inhalation into the right lung? Can you really feel very clearly this shoulder blade, it's almost a triangular shaped bone that can go up and down around your ribs as you lift. Can you spread your attention to a wider space to encompass? Can you spread your awareness around so that you can be very clear that you're able to be soft in your breathing as you do this? And then at some point, let your arm come back down and lift your knee and lift your arm and lift your knee. So you're alternating. And just do that until you're clear, until you feel like you've had enough, and then rest on your back, and we'll do a final scan. And so often we're, taught to just work straight through just to get things done, but that often sacrifices the quality of how we feel. I mean, we get the job done, but do we actually feel good doing it? Is a question I would ask. And notice if you're feeling like you're more in the middle of yourself. You could roll your head just a little bit briefly and then make it smaller, just to notice if there's more evenness in the way that your neck is moving. Is your head facing more forward? And do you feel the two sides of yourself more similar in terms of how they're resting on the floor? Noticing the space under your back on both sides. And notice also the length of the right side and the length of the left side. Compare the two. And it's always good to bring the lesson into something functional, something you recognize, and see if you can come to standing and walk around the room a little bit with this level of awareness, so that you start to be able to take the work off the mat and into your everyday life. So when you're ready, Come to standing so slowly that you could track how you do that. And maybe just notice if your feet feel more present. You know, when you walk, could you leave your feet on the floor as long as possible, some part of your foot on the floor as long as possible, and notice if there's more mobility there in your toes, more ability to catch yourself when you shift your weight onto the next leg. Could you imagine how this could be beneficial to help someone prevent falling if their feet were more able to catch them on the floor as they move? Could you imagine how this could be helpful for someone as they get older? And like, what if instead of getting less mobile, we just got more playful with movement and we didn't have to do bigger, more energetic exercise? We could just do little movement with awareness that was informed by curiosity, the way children learn. And with that, I will end the recording and see you next week. Thanks for joining us.
Yay!
Yay!